Good morning, afternoon, evening from wherever you are. My name is Peter Wooding and thank you for joining us. Today is episode 2 in our battery supply chain series. And I'm delighted to be joined by Adam from Romotion, where we're going to be discussing the current state of the EV market, both from a vehicle perspective and battery. So without further ado, if you don't mind, Adam, as new people are sort of joining the platform all the time, if you could just give us a sort of an intro about who you are, sort of where you're from and sort of what you're doing, and then we can get into a bit more of the nitty-gritty as we're talking through the session.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Thanks to Peter and his team for having me on today. My name is Adam Panayi. I'm the Managing Director of Romotion. We are a research and consultancy house primarily based in London, but we have people in China and we have language skills for Japan, Korea, and we have people in North America as well. So global outfit in some respects. And we focus on the downstream of the battery market. So we look at the demand outlooks for different parts of the battery supply chain. And I'll just run you through some of our various reports quickly while we're on the line. So just to say that we have this membership platform. I'll just put that onto membership platform, which brings you current up-to-date news and analysis on the EV and battery markets. On there, we also have our video and presentation archive, and it's also, this is the portal that we have for delivering our reports as well. Our reports are focused around monthly assessments and databases, and then quarterly outlooks, and then some focus reports as well. So what we did and what the premise of the company was when we first started was to do model by model analysis for the EV market as it pertains to the battery market. Now, our remit has expanded fairly significantly since then. So what we currently do is we still collect the model by model data, and for each model we're collecting, it goes up all the time, but it's roughly about 25 metrics in the moment. And in those are price, charging speed, charging interface, battery size, battery pack size, battery chemistry on both the cathode and the anode, battery cell supplier, the motors. Now we're taking more time to look at the motor piece, range, and so on, vehicle weight, about, like I said, about 25 metrics for each vehicle. And from that, when we get the sales data model by model, we're able to produce these aggregated reports, which first of which is our monthly EV battery chemistry assessment, which gives sales weighted pack sizes for each vehicle class and the split of battery chemistries every month. Another one we do is our EV charging assessment, which does the same thing, but instead of looking at batteries, it looks at the charging speed and the energy requirements of the fleet as it grows. And we also provide that data in its model by model form as well via our databases as well. So very, very extensive data coverage. There's something like 4,500 lines of data in one of our databases per month. Then on the longer term basis, we provide quarterly outlooks. At the moment, we have an EV and battery quarterly outlook. We have our global EV charging outlook, which covers something like 60 countries. And then we also have our battery energy stationary storage outlook, which is the other key part of the market. So if you're thinking about really how EV is going to grow, you need the charging, and then you need the infrastructure on top of the charging. And a big part of that is battery energy storage. And then we also have some focus reports at the moment as those markets are developing on fuel cell vehicles, EV micromobility, electric 2 and 3-wheelers. And we're going to be continue to adding to this all the time. Later in the year, we'll be bringing out a motors report as well. In terms of an intro, I think that's what I have. So maybe we can kick into the content now, Peter.
Thank you, Adam. And everybody make a note of Adam's details, because there's a lot of content that they provide that's worth you looking at. But for the first element for me this morning is the EV market. What's your take on sort of numbers, from where and where to, and how it's going to shape up for this year, Adam?
Sure. So what I've provided here is an analysis of last year and previous years to that. And then just coming into January of this year, the February number is also out now as well for most countries, that not for all of the ones in this chart, so I haven't updated it, but China they're out and they're fairly strong, although there is a drop month to month. But okay, so the key trends here really are, if you think about 2020, Europe really rose up in terms of meeting China in terms of overall volumes for the EV market. So previously, China has been roughly half the market in every year for the last couple of years, and really was the dominant market in that space. But in 2020, the European market really stepped up and is now equal in terms of overall volumes to the Chinese market. Where it does differ is that in the Chinese market, roughly 80% of the vehicles sold are battery electric and about 20% are plug-in hybrid. Whereas in Europe last year, it was about 50-50, or give or take a few percentage points either side. So that's a key thing to think about. And we're going to talk about battery chemistry shortly, but that is really a key determinant of what happens in the battery chemistry piece, but also in the battery demand piece as well. So something to think about there, because a typical battery electric vehicle has a battery pack size roughly 5 times the size of a plug-in hybrid. So the fact that there is that disparity in the relative share of plug-in hybrids versus battery electrics makes a big difference both on a regional and a global level in terms of battery demand. The other piece here to talk about really, before we get into a bit more detail on this, is the US and Canada, where the market has been effectively stagnating for the last couple of years. There's been no support at federal level for the EV market beyond the tax credit that was volume capped. And for the two main OEMs that really operate in the EV market in the US, which is Tesla and GM, they both exceeded the caps a while ago anyway. So that tax credit became almost an irrelevance in that market last year. And obviously, from November last year, we had the election, and we've had the Biden-Harris administration come into power this year, been sworn into power this year. And so in our latest quarterly outlook, that came out in February, we did something like a 5-page analysis on what we think the relative impacts of that could be. And I'm sure that's something Peter and I will get into. Just looking at the chart on the right, what you can see there is that in January, there's a big drop-off compared to December in terms of EV, so that's battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicle sales. I don't really think that's indicative of anything significant happening. If you cast your eye across to the left, you still see that that's a really significant increase on the previous January last year. Now, some of these year-on-year comparisons are going to get a little bit muddied as we move into the first quarter, or more into the first quarter, into the data coming out, because COVID really hit China in February, as you can see in that second bar on the left-hand side. And then that market started to recover March, April time. But in Europe, it hit really April, May, and then started to recover from that point out. But that's, there was a few questions when we released our monthly report for February, which includes the January numbers, about why that was. But really, it's partly seasonal. It's also partly due to the fact that in December, particularly in Europe, you see that big increase in Europe in December. A lot of that is to do with the CO2 compliance, that the fleet average CO2 compliance that European OEMs are going through currently. They really had to get their numbers up for the EV market in December in order to get the fleet average CO2 numbers down nearer to that 95 grams per kilometre target that they're having to hit. Again, I think that's something that Peter and I will be discussing momentarily. So I think perhaps, Peter, at this point, if you want to come in with some questions, and then we can...
Yes, please. Yeah. Firstly, really, is around the European legislation. And one of the sort of points for me is that we're seeing a 50-50 break from the global market on hybrid. And hybrid really, from my perspective personally, I feel we have to drive towards a total battery electric vehicle earlier. Is it a stopgap just to make sure we're hitting the figures, in your opinion, by having hybrids brought in first, or is it also looking to secure the contracts and everything else that goes with it with regarding to the ICE product range that's been going for the last sort of 100-ish years? So that was a little bit of a lot of questions in one there, but what's your take on it?
I think, I mean, all those issues are tied together. So for the plug-in hybrid piece, it's correct to say that it is a bit of a stopgap, I would say. And, you know, we talk to OEMs every time we do our long-term outlook, which is on a quarterly basis. And we, you know, run through a series of questions, and the attitudes to some of those questions changes every time and some doesn't. But with regards to the plug-in hybrid piece, it's almost a vital stepping stone towards net zero emissions at the point of use, right? So what's happening now is it can't be understated in terms of the seismic change that's happening in the automotive industry because of CO2 regulation, but also ultimately because of 2050 net zero targets that that we're all aiming towards over time, and the transport sector has to play its piece in that. So it would be, you know, one of the things that we have here is, and we were discussing it offline, weren't we, Peter? But what I said that, you know, you have this legislation piece here, and then you have almost like a confrontation with reality around what is achievable at an industrial scale or commercial scale from OEMs in terms of delivering these vehicles. And while we are seeing battery electrics starting to roll out now from, you know, the bigger players, and we'll get into the VW Power Day discussion later on, but plug-in hybrids allow OEMs to get their fleet average CO2 emissions down fairly significantly, whilst still leveraging their existing internal combustion engine supply chains, and also not overly exposing themselves to the battery electric supply chain, which really hasn't been built out yet. That battery electric supply chain, the rate at which, you know, we're going to have to be producing battery cells, cathode and anode material, all the you know, the lithium chemicals and the cobalt chemicals and the nickel sulfate and so on that goes into those cathode materials, and then the mining piece of that's really under construction currently. So it would just be very, very difficult, I would say, on all sorts of levels, for them to move straight to battery electric without this stepping stone of plug-in hybrid, at least seeing them part of the way. And the other piece of that is as well, if you do an analysis, which we have done, on meeting the current 95 grams per kilometre target, and then the subsequent ones down to 58, which is coming towards 2030, you can actually get most of the way there with HEV, so that's, you know, non-plug-in hybrid, but hybrid, which generally speaking has a 1 to 2 kilowatt hour battery, largely Toyota that dominates that market currently, and then plug-in hybrid as well. Because if you think about your typical internal combustion engine vehicle in Europe, this is the pretty much the average CO2 emissions from that vehicle will be about 150 grams per kilometre. Then when you bring that a hybridization of, you know, mild hybridization or a hybridization without plug-in, that comes down to about 125, something like that. And then when you bring in plug-in hybrid, it comes right down to about 50 grams per kilometre. And obviously battery electric, it's zero at the point of use. So if you just do a sort of back of an envelope calculation on all that, you can get all the way down to the 2030 target just by plug-in hybrid and some battery electric at that point as well. But ultimately, if we are going to move to net zero by 2050, then we are going to need BEV, and OEMs are making very, you know, sensible decisions, I would say, in my view, about, okay, well, we are going to have to build out BEV. We are going to need these supply chains. We'll start building that out now. That's why they're building BEVs now. Frankly, they don't need to potentially, but and that means it'll be well and truly ready when some of these ICE bans eventually hit, if they do, and the net zero targets in the distant future start to come in. So, yeah, I mean, you're basically turning around a mega tanker, if you want to use a maritime analogy there. So it's a huge industry they're having to turn around. Yeah, that's probably my piece on that. I could probably go on.
To be fair, and to be fair, I'll use Jaguar Land Rover as an example. Yeah. They really have sort of promoted a challenge, really. You know, they're going to be battery production more sort of by 2030, and there's 5 years after that. So by 2035, technically, all vehicles that are going to be sold will be battery electric only, or a hydrogen or a different fuel opportunity. Yeah. But that's ambitious, you know. we look back over this COVID scenario, I'll call it that because I don't know another word really to use it for it. But when you look back, we've been living with that for a year. And a car maker is looking at changing the entire basis of their historic vehicle production in a 9 to 14 year cycle, which is pretty staggering. So I think it's admirable. So I'm not knocking the hybrid element. I think it's a perfect footprint moving forward. Absolutely. But looking at the overall targets, in my opinion, it's what we need. We need to have a cleaner vehicle park. And I'm delighted to see so many vehicle manufacturers actually stepping up. When I'm looking at the chart, though, and I'm looking at US and Canada, they haven't moved really over the last year in terms of volume at all, have they?
No, I mean, what that tells you is it's almost like a case study in how much does government intervention matter in this market. So government intervention starts with legislation. That, you know, that's the hard written in stone legislation around emissions, be that CO2 or nitrous oxide or particulate matter or whatever else. So, and then it moves into the slightly softer but easier lever, which is subsidies and incentives. And I mean, this is the other point about last year in Europe, is that you had the CO2 piece, which is the hard piece, and then you had the soft piece, which is the subsidies and incentives. And effectively, every major European market just pulled this enormous lever to kickstart this market in last year. I mean, we had in Germany, you could achieve a €9,000 per vehicle subsidy for an EV, which is an extraordinary amount of money. I mean, there's loads of caveats to that, and I don't want to just overplay that, but there's similar sort of numbers in France. I think it was about €7,000. And that, I mean, that just shows you that when governments choose to intervene in this market, it can really accelerate, especially in this early stage. I don't think that's true longer term, because it just wouldn't be fiscally prudent to do that. But in this early stage, when the numbers are still relatively small, it's something that governments could do. Whereas in the US, you've had virtually no federal level support. There is support at various state levels. You know, it is where you would think it would be, up the northeastern seaboard and on the west coast as well. And you know, that's kept the market ticking along. But it does show you that if you don't have this sort of national level intervention in the early stages of the market, it just won't grow. And it feels sort of counterintuitive in the US as well, because they've got the single biggest electric vehicle manufacturer in the world there, Tesla, which is a native industry leading the world in terms of technology. You think that there would be quite a lot of enthusiasm for supporting this market, but you know, we've had a big change of administration in the US this year, as they're coming this year. We've been speaking to the US OEMs and thinking about, you know, asking them what they think will be the impact of that. They don't think that the impact is that great this year because of the way that the House of Congress and House of Senate are set up and the way that the legislation passes in the US. It does take a while to get things through. But you know, 2022, 2023, you'll start to see that number really increase in the US. I would have thought. We are expecting pretty significant growth this year as well, just from an organic growth that you'd get from the retirement of older vehicles as well. But yeah, it is a case study in that, and China again is a case study in that as well, because it's not shown on either of these charts particularly clearly, but in 2019, the Chinese government halved the level of subsidy available to the markets. It went down for, I think it was $7,000 per vehicle down to something like $3,500 in the June of that year. And what you saw was a massive pre-buy effect in the first 6 months of 2019, and then a big drop off in the second half of 2019. I think they caught even the authorities there slightly on the back foot, that level of impact that they had. So they've now reintroduced some measures in China to stimulate the market, although it's a much lower level than it was historically. In China, the reason for the growth is a couple of reasons, but the first being economic growth in China has surpassed anywhere else in the world in the last 12 months because they've recovered from COVID better than anyone else. The other point is in China, you've got an availability of vehicles that's unsurpassed anywhere in the world for battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric. You can go and buy a pure battery electric vehicle in China for $5,000, which is extraordinary. I mean, it's got a tiny battery, very small range, but it was last year, it was the best-selling EV in China for the months that it was available. It's actually a part GM joint venture, actually, that vehicle in China. It's like a 14 kilowatt hour battery. But so that's the other thing, that Chinese market is sort of maturing naturally. And also the third thing for China as well is that you have much lower overall per capita vehicle ownership. And as the new middle class comes up in China and those people start to buy cars, they've got no preconceived prejudices against EVs or in favor of ICEs, and really no experience of vehicle ownership prior to this. So them buying an EV from scratch is no big deal psychologically for them. So that's quite an interesting part of the equation as well.
Well, this leads us really nicely into the let's look at the battery supply chain.
Yeah.
Because this is what needs to be there to back all the targets that we have everywhere. So.
Yeah. So maybe I'll introduce this chart and then we can get into the detail of it. So what this shows you is the split for 2020 for all vehicle classes. So this includes bus and coaches and what medium and heavy duty trucks there are in the market. It shows the split of different battery chemistries on the cathode side for different regions. So just running through here, you see that China, big share of LFP. A lot of that is buses, but it's also becoming a fairly substantial part of the passenger car market as well. Also in there, you see in China, NCM 811, which is not really used anywhere else in the world really yet. We can get into that as well in a bit more detail, and if people want to ask questions, they're welcome to. And then in Europe, big share of NCM 622/712. The 712 has come out sort of later in the year with the ID3 and LG Chem based technology. And that's basically, what that tells you versus China is that the European OEMs have been reluctant to move to very low cobalt chemistries in the near term because of all the issues you get around thermal management and cycle life and so on. So they've opted for this 622 and now more lately for some of them as the 712 technology. Also a big chunk of 523 in there, and 523 is a preferred technology, I would say, for plug-in hybrids because it's got that higher cobalt content, and the charge and discharge cycle for a plug-in hybrid is a lot more aggressive than it is for a BEV. So you need that cobalt in there to balance the system. Much lower LFP piece there, and we'll get onto the VW piece because I know people are probably quite keen to hear about that. In the US, you've got a big share of NCA there. That's basically Tesla. That's effectively Tesla's technology via Panasonic. But it just shows you the dominance of Tesla in that market there. And then adding it all together, you see the blend global, including all the other regions as well. But that's sort of a quick overview of those markets. Now, Pete, if you don't mind, I'll just jump in straight on to what the upshot of this
battery technology.
What this means looking forward, because what you would have seen if you followed the VW Power Day on Monday, and we've done a briefing on that, and if you want it, just get in touch and I can send over the briefing that we've done for that. But what they said was that they've got effectively a four-way trajectory for the future of their vehicles over the next decade, effectively. It's been, as you can see in that chart, it's very unusual for LFP to be deployed in Europe in a passenger car vehicle. That share that you see there is probably all buses, actually, I think. I can't really think of many LFP bearing vehicles in the EU. But what they said is that for their micro, or what they call the entry level vehicles, they will be LFP based. Now, we've been saying that that's probably likely to be the case for a while. It's already happened in China, and China leads the way on these markets overall. Then they said that they would be using what's called NM technology, not just nickel manganese. So it's dropping cobalt from a nickel manganese based battery, which is as yet not actually in the market. There's a company called Esvolt in China who are looking to release their version of that, what they call NMX, later in the year. And that will be mainly a Chinese-led technology for the time being. But VW is saying that they think that's a very, very promising technology, and that they foresee that a fair part of their output will be bearing that technology, which we actually upgraded our forecast for that in the last quarterly report. To be completely frank, I mean, to hear a major OEM back it in that way it raised a few eyebrows with us, but we again, as a base on the result of that, we will be thinking again about what share we consider that to be. The way that we address this is actually quite similar to how VW explained it on Monday, which is that when we do our forecast, we do a market segmentation, from micro compacts through to SUV, and do similar things with the bus and coach and truck markets as well, and then we address certain industries to those segments, and that is quite pleasing to hear VW think about it in the same way. And then what they said is for the NCM cathodes, or battery technology, they'll be using that in more of their luxury market, which again makes sense because NCM has a higher range. It's also a higher cost potentially as well. What is a bit of an unknown there is what NCM cathode that will be, because like I said, in Europe at the moment, the deployment is around 622 and 712. And the European OEMs and the US OEMs as well, so if you just think about Western OEMs, well, generally, they've held off from going to 811 because of the risks involved with it from a thermal management point of view. So what we think is going to happen is that in the Western world, there'll just be a step change from this 622712 piece to eventually, when the OEMs are ready, they'll go to ultra high nickel. So they may even go above and beyond this 811 piece straight to 9.5.5, which will be the next technology on the horizon in that NCM piece. So it's, I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen, but it seems likely that that would be the case. I think 811 will be a China technology almost entirely, and then it will then just move to higher and higher nickel as we go forward. But there's a lot to take in there. The fourth part actually that VW raised pertains actually more to the anode, I would say, which is around solid state technology. They obviously have a big share of the QuantumScape, which is a solid state developer. And in fact, we are doing an online interview with QuantumScape at the end of the month, if you would like to sign up for that. But the solid state is a completely different issue, really. But the timeline for that is quite aggressive. I think they're saying 2025 for that. I would say that's probably when you start to see it on test vehicles and so on. But we'll hear more from them later in the month anyway. But it was a lot to take in this week. And the point is, and what I put in the title of this this slide is that its classifications are becoming slightly blurred. And if you've been following this market for a while, you would know that people are ready to talk about these things at 111, 523, 622, in very rigid terms. What you're starting to see now is, frankly, that the scale is getting to the point where an OEM can say, well, we want the battery to do this, produce it for us. And at that point, the classification becomes a bit meaningless, because the battery cell manufacturer and their, the precursor material and the cathode and the anode material will be tailored towards that objective. Now, that wasn't possible when the vehicle market was so much smaller, because you have to get the scale up to make these things cost efficient. And as the scale continues to expand, I would expect that the proliferation of these various different chemistries will get wider and wider. For us, that's a bit awkward, because we do forecasting for this 20 years out, and you need to have classifications to make this a meaningful comparative analysis. But what you do then is you group it and you tell people what's in each group, and there will be families of chemistries, I think, is the way to think about that going forward. Been speaking for quite a long time on that, Peter, so maybe if you want to come in with some questions on that, and I'll happily answer them.
There we go. We've had a question sort of from the floor, as I'll call it.
Yep.
It's a two-part question. The first part's the disposal of exhausted and damaged batteries in a sustainable way.
Yeah.
What are the possibilities of recycling, etc.? Now, Javier, who put the question in, we have an entire session next week covering that particular topic altogether, because it is quite complex in relation to how. Have you any thoughts yourself on that, or Adam, or should we leave Javier waiting a little bit until next week, because he will really get answered in detail on this?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely got thoughts on the overriding picture of that, and then I'm sure your session next week will get more into the practicalities of it. But the reality is that the world is not awash with the materials that we're going to need for these batteries, and you know, like as I said earlier, the mining supply chain for this is really only being built out now. It's happening at sort of breakneck speed in virtually all the important minerals that we're going to need. So the point around recycling is that there's a dual necessity there. The first necessity is around the critical minerals you're going to need. So you're going to want them out of the exhausted batteries, just in order to plug supply chain gaps that mining can't fulfill. And economics will determine that, I would say. I think, you know, that there's an imperative there anyway, from an economic and a strategic point of view, for that to happen. The second point is around what you might call ESG, or you know, like and the environmental piece, which is these batteries are made up of heavy metals that you really don't want leaching into groundwater or anything else, frankly, for that matter. So the storage and disposal of these batteries at the end of life is going to be imperative for everyone that's involved in this market to really take care of, because you really don't want a scandal around this equivalent to Dieselgate or whatever else that could impinge upon the ability of OEMs to promote this technology as a green technology, and ultimately to recoup the enormous investments that they're making in the supply chain and in their own processes and their own manufacturing facilities, for something as I don't know, it's not trivial, but it's something as minor as not processing these batteries properly at the end of life. And I don't say minor to be disparaging, but really, in terms of the big picture, that it's a smaller part of it. But there are enormous practical implications for that. And again, as with the supply chain feeding into these vehicles, there's not really an established process for dealing with spent lithium-ion batteries as we move forward. There are plenty of people looking to get into it because they recognise the economic value of it. And that will get built out over time, and I have absolutely no concerns about that, really, because it's investable and there will be money in it. The other piece as well is around the spent battery piece, is around second life and what happens there. Now, there will be use cases for energy storage, for storage for charging and so on. And again, there are plenty of companies piling into that sector because they recognise that there's an economic imperative to do it.
Thank you. I hope that satisfies you for this week, and Javier, and apologies for the push for our session for next week. But part two of his question was the expected technological evolution of batteries, like solid state batteries or other alternatives. What's your take on that, Adam?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I gave on the cathode side, I gave a pretty good overview of my view on that for the cathode side. But for solid state, okay, on the anode side, which is effectively what the solid state deals with, also, as well as the electrolyte. But you've got a couple of different transitions happening currently, actually. One is around the transition from purely synthetic graphite to natural and synthetic graphite. That's going to be ongoing almost in perpetuity. The second stage you can think about is the inclusion of silicon. At the moment, it's silicon oxide, and that's being dosed into high-end anodes for things like Teslas and so on, for increased energy density and increased performance. That's already happening. We're at a ratio of probably maybe 6% silicon up to about 10% maximum, I would say absolute maximum currently. Now that will continue to grow, that dosing will continue to grow in the conventional graphite anode, carbon anode. The next step then would be silicon dominant anodes, which is under development currently. There's companies like Sealer Nanotechnologies and a few others involved in that. That's the horizon for that is probably middle of the decade before that becomes a meaningful part, or really before it actually gets deployed commercially on vehicles. On solid state, the thing is with solid state, there's actually a couple of different things happening with solid state, and there's a number of things being called solid state that that have quite different technical parameters, frankly. So there is actually solid state in the bus market now from a company called Polare Blue Energy. They provide, I think it's e-Citaro, Mercedes-Benz or Daimler buses already. They've come into the market this year. But that solid state is actually a traditional cathode and anode. It's just the way that the battery has been layered makes it solid state. So I think really when people talk about solid state, what they mean is a lithium metal anode, a ceramic or a polymer or some other garnet electrolyte. And that's when you see the really big increases in energy density and performance and charge speed potentially as well. And that is a longer stage process as the market moves forward. And, that's again, I think you're going to start to see workable prototypes on vehicles middle of the decade, and the deployment sort of, that second half of the decade, I'd say. If you'd asked me that 2 years ago, I would have said 2030 onwards, but that has moved forwards quite quickly actually in the last couple of years. There's a lot of money going into it as well. Nothing really changes on the cathode side there. That's really electrolyte and anode that is a development for.
Thank you, Adam. If we could now move on to, thank you, your slides here already, looking at charging developments, and what's the relationship between charging rollout and EV uptake, as well as the charging speed and battery technology. So that's quite a chunk to be covering. So what's your thoughts?
Yeah. So again, I mean, I think the thing is here that around charging, it's sort of ignored and misunderstood in probably equal measure, because especially the background that our company started from, which is battery, but now we've really moved into charging in quite a big way actually, because it's necessary, and infrastructure as well. People talk about it's important to sell these vehicles, but ultimately you are going to need some sort of infrastructure to deal with them. But the reality is that there's been quite a significant disconnect between vehicle markets and charging development in the last couple of years. And I would say, and I put this in the title, is because demographics are equally important to the rate of charging coverage you need as the rate of development of the EV market is at present. So I'll give you two extreme examples here on our chart. One is Norway, which you see in sort of top middle of the bubbles there, and the other one is China, which is bottom right. And the point here is that in Norway, you've got the highest rate of EV penetration anywhere in the world. It's well over 50% now. But you've got the worst, I mean, in inverted commas, because it's not really, I don't think you can think about it in those terms, but the worst ratio of EVs to chargers anywhere in the world. Whereas in China, it's still the biggest market in terms of volume, and certainly in terms of fleet or park for electric vehicles anywhere in the world. And then you've got one of the best ratios for that. Now, how can those things be mutually true in different parts of the world? Well, the answer is demographics, right? And so in Norway, if you look at the types of vehicles being sold, those are expensive vehicles for the most part. You can infer from that to some extent the type of people buying them. But also, if you just look at the data on where people live in Norway and how people live, the rate of urbanization is a lot lower than it is in China. The number of single family households is much, much higher. The number of people living in high density housing is much, much lower. So what that tells you is that people are charging at home, is the short answer to that. So that if people are able to charge at home, they probably have a level 2 charger at home, and therefore the public infrastructure doesn't need to be as well built out in this near term. In China, actually everything I just said about Norway is just the inverse. Basically, the amount of people living in cities is much higher, the rate of urbanization is much higher, people living in high density households, high density housing is much higher. Therefore, people don't have access to private charging, and therefore the public infrastructure needs to be much more built out. There was another chart I was going to put on here as well. This shows you effectively fast charging, but even when you include slow charging, it is still a similar picture. But what you also see is in China, the ratio of fast chargers to slow chargers is much higher than it is anywhere else in the world. That's for similar reasons as well, because the slow charging can take place at workplaces, homes, shopping centres, that sort of thing. The fast charging has to happen on forecourts, or is needed on forecourts, and even roadside charging, I would say, to some extent as well. So that's what we're, really come to terms with. We built this really quite extravagant model about how this is going to look in the future, and in that is all of these data points I've been talking about. What does the demographic position of that country look like in terms of urbanization, etc. Another key point as well is this share of battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles as well. Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, for the most part, get charged at home, and if the owner has access to or can facilitate that from their house to the vehicle. So in Europe, that also slows down the rate of charging development you need. But what all this means is that in the long term, none of these provisos really hold true, because in the long term, what you will see is more and more people coming into this market. It will become more and more of an urban market in the Western world as well. And at that point, the charging infrastructure is going to need to be there in mass to support that. But I would say that from a charging point of view, if I was a charging network developer or equipment supplier, this little bit of leeway we have now in the market to build out that infrastructure is quite positive, because what you've seen, if another set of data I'm going to show is the ratio of chargers to EVs over time in each of these markets. In most markets, it's got worse in the last couple of years, because the EV market has accelerated so much faster than the charging market. And that's because you can sell electric vehicles, but for charging, you've got to dig up the ground, you've got to get permits, there's all these sorts of things that you need to do. So, what I'm suggesting here is I'm not downplaying the necessity of the charging build out at all. What I'm saying is that we have, by dint of demographics, some time to catch up to the EV market in the Western world. And China shows it's possible as well, as China has been doing in lots of ways in this market.
When you look, though, at the EV uptake, the biggest challenge used to be with people, or the mindset, was range and range anxiety. But if we can get the correct infrastructure in place with the right proportion of fast charging, we are no longer having this range anxiety and having to have massive ranges with bigger batteries, more excess weight in the vehicle. If we approach this right, would you agree with that or not?
Broadly speaking, I would actually. I mean, less so now, but certainly a year ago or 2 years ago, when you're having discussions, there was this idea that there would just be this exponential growth in battery pack sizes as batteries got cheaper. And we were all saying, well, what would be the point? Because it would be almost like driving around with a bigger and bigger fuel tank all the time. So you're adding, even if the batteries get cheaper, you're still adding unnecessary cost. And it's going to be hard enough for OEMs to make margins in this business anyway, that they will, I would think, look to place an appropriate size battery. So two things, yeah. I mean, you make good points there, that as the charging infrastructure becomes more widely available and faster, that will ease people's apprehensions about range and therefore could weigh on pack sizes longer term. The other piece is that as the type of vehicles coming onto the market gets more diverse, that will affect pack sizes anyway, because what you've seen in the West is that it tends to be larger vehicles that have been electrified because they're luxury and fit into that market. Whereas if you look at China, especially in the last 12 months or 18 months, that market has become much more like a normal vehicle market. There's a bit of everything in there. If VW's presentation on Monday told us anything, it was that they are thinking about that as well. There will be a range of these types of vehicles available over time. And some of them will have smaller pack sizes because they're just smaller vehicles and their use case is just different. You know, they're for urban mobility, that for taking the kids to school or going to shops or driving to and from work, they don't need to go 300 miles. But at the same time, there will be vehicles that do go 300 miles. So, yeah, I mean, it's that. I think you've made a good point there, Peter, that there will be. It's not a given that pack sizes continue to rise, or that a bigger pack sizes are the be all and end all in this market.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We are actually out of time, and it's sort of it's gone so quickly, and it was really sort of informative. So thank you. Would you have anything you want to leave as a takeaway for the audience, Adam, on your perspective on anything else before we have to sort of close?
Yeah, I'd say that, from our point of view and the preoccupations that we have, which are around battery chemistry, and then on the charging piece, what types of chargers will be deployed and why and how and where. For us, I think that the point on the battery chemistry piece is that it will be driven by use case over time, and as scale increases, your ability to create, interim technologies or iterations of different technologies will become expanded, because the scale will be there to make that economically viable. On the charging side and the infrastructure side, I'd say that really, when we're advising clients that are actually putting in equipment and charging infrastructure, it's around, look at what's happening in the vehicle market. Can these vehicles actually charge at some of these really high speeds? And where and how should you deploy different types of chargers to make them economically viable as well from an operator point of view? But again, I could probably go on for another half hour or so on that. But I'll leave it there. I'll just encourage people to reach out to me either via your platform or direct. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn, Twitter, and my email address is on this presentation. If you want this, I think we'll put it up onto the platform. And also, if you want to reach out to me as well, it's apanayi@romotion.com. So again, thank you very much for having us on, Peter.
No, thank you very much for joining us again, and hopefully we'll see you again perhaps in May to see what changes, because these changes are happening all the time. It's quite amazing, and especially given the circumstances that everybody's been through as well. So thank you, keep safe, and we will hopefully, please. That's an invite, by the way.
Oh, good. Well, consider it accepted.
See you again in May, if not before. Take care. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Bye, everyone.
Hi, it's Peter again, and thank you for watching the within the EV community. Send messages to each other and start to build relationships for the future. Also, take a look at our supplier showrooms. Our partners have got lots of products and services that they have to offer, which again could be of benefit to you. Make the most of the opportunity, and thank you again for joining us.